Elah's silence, suffocating dread. For 40 days, the sun had risen over the ridges, illuminating a stalemate that had turned the air stagnant and thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and fear. Thousands of men stood in the ranks, yet the valley felt empty, hollowed out by the weight of an unseen expectation. No birds sang in the scrub brush. No wind stirred the dust between the opposing lines. The soldiers of Israel stood with their weight shifted to their heels, eyes fixed on the horizon, muscles locked in a permanent, trembling tension. They were breathing, but they were not living. Every man knew that the stillness would break, and every man knew that when it did, the cost would be absolute. The ground beneath their feet felt fragile, as if the earth itself were waiting for a blow that would shatter the line of defense. The valley was a throat, and it was closing shut. The soldiers stared into the distance, waiting for the inevitable. The silence was not a pause, it was a countdown. The first sound was not a shout, but a rhythmic, metallic clatter that vibrated through the soles of the soldiers' boots. It was the sound of iron striking iron, a slow, deliberate cadence that cut through the stagnant air like a blade. From the shadow of the Philistine camp, a figure emerged, dwarfing the horizon. Every step he took forced the earth to shudder, a physical manifestation of the power that had held the valley hostage for 40 days. The soldiers of Israel did not move, but their eyes widened, tracking the mountain of a man as he stepped into the center of the clearing. He stopped. He inhaled, his chest expanding like a bellows, and then he spoke. His voice was not a roar. It was a low, grinding rumble that seemed to pull the breath from the lungs of every man within earshot. It rolled across the valley floor, hitting the Israelite ranks with the force of a physical blow. He mocked them, his words sharp and jagged, designed to carve through their remaining resolve. Each syllable acted like a wedge, driving deeper into the collective heart of the army. Far from the front lines, inside the royal tent, the air was stagnant and smelled of old parchment and cold ash. King Saul sat on a low stool, his back to the entrance. He had once been a man of iron, but now he was a man of frayed nerves. He stared at the map spread across the table, his fingers tracing the borders of a kingdom that felt increasingly like a memory. His hands were not steady. They shook with a rhythmic, uncontrollable tremor that he tried to mask by gripping the edge of the table. He did not look up when the muffled roar of the giant echoed from the valley. He simply closed his eyes, his breath hitching. The crown sat on a nearby chest, gathering dust, ignored and heavy with the weight of his failure. He reached for a goblet, but his grip failed, and the vessel clattered against the wood. He did not reach for it again. He simply sat, paralyzed, watching the shadows lengthen across the floor, waiting for the end of everything he had built. Far from the suffocating shadows of the royal tent, the air in the hills of Bethlehem tasted of wild thyme and dry earth. Here, the horizon was not a wall of fear, but a vast, jagged expanse of limestone and scrub brush. David moved across the ridge with the fluid, calculated stride of one who knew every hollow and stone. His staff struck the ground with a rhythmic, solid thud, a sound that echoed against the silence of the valley below. He stopped at the edge of a steep drop, his eyes scanning the thickets where the shadows deepened. He adjusted his stance, planting his feet firmly into the loose shale, and checked the perimeter of the flock. He spent his days navigating the sharp inclines, and his nights under the vast, unblinking canopy of stars. In this rugged solitude, he was being forged, not by the clamor of war, but by the steady, demanding rhythm of the hill. The silence of the thicket snapped. A low, guttural vibration rolled through the brush, followed by the sudden, sharp scent of musk and heat. David did not turn to run. He shifted his weight, his heels digging into the soft earth as a shadow erupted from the dense foliage. A lion, muscles coiled like steel, lunged toward the center of the flock. David moved before the beast could land. He lunged forward, throwing his entire body weight into the path of the predator. His hands found the thick, coarse fur of the lion's mane. The impact jarred his shoulders, the sheer force of the animal nearly driving him into the dirt. He held on, his knuckles white, his grip locked against the thrashing weight. The lion roared, a sound that tore through the quiet air, but David did not loosen his hold. He drove his knee into the ground, bracing himself against the frantic, clawing resistance. With a sharp, sudden twist, he forced the beast's head down, his muscles burning with the strain of the struggle. He struck with a heavy, calculated blow, the force of his arm behind it. The lion collapsed, its momentum spent, hitting the ground with a dull, final thud. David stood over the fallen predator, his chest heaving, his hands still trembling from the exertion. The woods remained tense, the air still heavy with the scent of the previous struggle. David had barely wiped the dust from his palms when the brush to his left exploded outward. A massive shape tore through the thicket, snapping branches like dry twigs. A bear, towering and broad, rose on its hind legs, its claws raking the air. David lunged to the side, but the beast swiped, catching his staff and sending it spinning into the dark undergrowth. He was unarmed, left with nothing but his own reach, and the hard, uneven ground beneath his boots. The bear dropped to all fours, its weight shaking the earth as it charged. David did not retreat. He planted his feet, leaning into the momentum, and waited for the split second of impact. As the creature lunged, he stepped inside its reach, driving his shoulder into its chest, with every ounce of his strength. The bear grunted, its massive frame stumbling back against the force of the collision. David followed, his hands gripping the thick hide, using the bear's own weight to pivot it away from the scattered sheep. He forced the animal toward the steep incline, his boots sliding in the loose gravel. With a final, desperate shove, he broke the bear's balance. It scrambled for purchase, let out a frustrated, guttural roar, and turned back into the shadows of the deep forest. The adrenaline of the day faded as the sun dipped behind the jagged horizon. David sat on a flat, weathered stone, his chest still rising and falling with the rhythm of his breathing. He reached into the grass and retrieved his harp, the wood smooth and worn from years of constant use. He did not look at the shadows where the predators had emerged. Instead, he looked up. The sky stretched out, a vast, ink-black canopy pierced by the sharp, cold light of distant stars. He pulled the strings, the notes vibrating through the cool night air, cutting through the lingering tension of the valley. Each pluck was deliberate, a slow, measured cadence that filled the silence. He closed his eyes, letting the music dictate the pace of his thoughts. The strength he had used to strike the lion and the bear felt distant now, secondary to the weight of the silence. He was not a warrior in this moment. He was a listener. He felt the vastness of the world pressing in, and in that pressure, he found his center. He played until his fingers grew stiff, his mind clearing of the day's violence. He was learning that the power which had guided his hand against the beasts was not his own. It was a quiet, steady current, and he surrendered to it completely, sitting motionless under the stars as the music drifted into the dark. The morning light broke over the ridge, cold and sharp. David was still on the stone, his fingers resting on the silent strings of his harp. When the sound of heavy footsteps crunched against the gravel, Jesse stood at the edge of the clearing, his face etched with the lines of long years and the weight of a household. He did not ask about the night or the beasts. He carried a woven basket, the smell of fresh bread and parched grain rising from it. He set it down between them with a thud that broke the morning calm. "The front lines need supplies," Jesse said, his voice raspy and direct. "Your brothers are holding the line against the Philistines. Take this to them. Check on their welfare. Do not linger." End quote. David stood. The transition from the quiet of his worship to the urgency of the task immediate. He looked at the basket, then at the path winding down toward the valley floor. He did not argue or hesitate. He lifted the basket, feeling the solid weight of the grain against his arm, a stark contrast to the lightness of the harp. He secured his staff, adjusted his grip, and turned his back on the familiar hills of Bethlehem. He walked with a steady, measured pace, the the basket heavy, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The terrain shifted from rolling hills to a jagged, dust-choked basin. As David descended, the air grew thick, smelling of stale sweat and unwashed iron. He reached the perimeter of the Israelite camp, expecting the sharp, disciplined sounds of a standing army. Instead, he found a hollow, vibrating silence. Men stood in clusters, their hands gripping their spears so tightly their knuckles turned white. No one spoke. No one moved. Then, the ground beneath David's feet shuddered. A rhythmic, heavy booming echoed from the opposing ridge, the sound of a mountain moving. The soldiers of Israel recoiled, stepping back in unison as if pulled by a single, invisible wire. Their faces were drained of color, eyes fixed on the gap between the hills. A voice erupted. A deep, guttural roar that seemed to tear the very air apart. It was a challenge, jagged and cruel. Echoing off the canyon walls, David stood at the edge of the line, the basket of bread heavy in his arms. He watched a soldier drop his shield, the metal clattering against the rocks. The giant stepped into the open, a massive, towering figure that eclipsed the sun. The army of Israel did not advance. They withered, trapped in a cage of fear. David set the basket of bread down on the hard-packed earth. The weight of the grain no longer mattered. He looked at the soldiers, their shoulders hunched, their eyes darting toward the giant and then away, as if looking directly at the enemy would invite death. The giant roared again, a sound that vibrated in David's chest, but it did not make him recoil. Instead, it made his pulse quicken with a cold, sharp clarity. This was not a military standoff. This was not a matter of spears, shields, or the tactical advantage of the high ground. To the men around him, the giant was a physical mountain that could not be moved. To David, the giant was a voice of defiance, a direct insult hurled against the Creator. The fear that had paralyzed the camp seemed to evaporate from David's mind, replaced by a sudden, searing heat. He felt the tension in his own muscles, not of terror, but of readiness. He stood taller, his gaze locking onto the massive figure across the valley. The mockery, the arrogance, the blatant disregard for the living God, it was an offense that demanded a response. He did not look for a commander or a strategy. He simply looked at the giant, and for the first time, he saw not a monster, but a target. David turned to the men nearest him, his voice cutting through the heavy, stagnant air of the camp. He asked who this man was, and why the army stood silent while the giant mocked the living God. The soldiers stared at the ground, but a voice from behind him snapped like a whip. It was Eliab. His face was tight, veins pulsing in his neck as he shoved David toward the rear of the line. He hissed accusations of pride, mocking David for leaving the sheep in the hills to play at being a warrior. The men around them shifted, eyes darting between the brothers, waiting for David to retreat in shame. But David did not step back. He looked directly into Eliab's eyes, his own gaze steady and devoid of fear. David pulled his arm away from Eliab's grip. He turned his back on his brother, dismissing the criticism. He raised his voice and asked, "Is there not a cause?" The officers did not speak as they led David toward the center of the camp. They moved through the rows of tents, their footsteps heavy, until they reached the command enclosure. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burnt oil and old sweat. King Saul sat on a low stool, his head bowed, his hands resting on his knees. He looked up as the flap of the tent fell shut, his eyes scanning David with a weary, hollow intensity. The king's face was etched with the lines of long-held anxiety, his breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. He did not rise. He simply stared, searching for the fear he expected to find in the boy. David stood perfectly still. He did not avert his gaze, nor did he shift his weight to signal submission. He watched the king, noting the tremor in the monarch's fingers, and the way his shoulders slumped under an invisible burden. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. As the two men measured each other, David waited, his jaw set, ready to speak the words that would shatter the king's doubt. David broke the silence. his voice low but carrying a resonance that seemed to vibrate against the tent walls. "I will fight him," he said. The words were simple, stripped of any boast or hesitation. Saul let out a sharp, dry sound, a laugh that held no mirth, only the bitter edge of exhaustion. He gestured toward the boy's slender frame, his fingers trembling as he pointed to the empty space where a soldier should have been. The king's eyes were wide, searching for a sign of madness, but found only a quiet, terrifying clarity. David did not blink. He stepped forward, his boots pressing firmly into the dirt floor. He spoke of the hills of Bethlehem, of the lion that had lunged from the thicket and the bear that had dared to threaten the flock. He described the weight of the beast's mane in his grip and the force of his own hands as he struck them down. Every sentence was a physical account, a memory of resistance that had nothing to do with swords or shields. He stood before the monarch, his posture unyielding, his breathing slow and rhythmic. The king's laughter died in his throat, replaced by a heavy, stunned stillness. Saul watched the boy, the skepticism in his gaze faltering. Saul gestured to his attendants. They moved with practiced efficiency, bringing forward the heavy bronze plates intended for a king. They began to strap the rigid metal onto David, pulling the leather cords tight until the weight settled hard against his shoulders. David stood still, letting them work. But with every piece they added, the air in the room seemed to grow thin. The metal was cold, unyielding, and pressed into his skin with a relentless, biting pressure. He tried to lift his arm, but the movement was sluggish, hampered by the sheer mass of the plates. He took a step, and the clatter of the bronze echoed like a prison door locking shut. The weight was not just physical. It was a crushing, artificial burden. He reached up, his fingers struggling to find purchase against the smooth, hard surface. But the metal offered no grip. He was trapped. He was a bird in a cage, pinned by the expectations of a man who had forgotten how to move with freedom. The silence in the tent deepened. David reached for the first buckle. His fingers, now steady, worked the leather strap until it gave way with a sharp snap. The heavy bronze plate slid down his chest and hit the dirt floor with a dull, ringing thud that echoed through the tent. He did not pause. He pulled at the shoulder guards, the metal clattering as it fell away, leaving his skin exposed to the cool air of the command post. With every piece that hit the ground, the pressure on his chest eased. He twisted his shoulders, feeling the muscles loosen, the stiffness of the metal replaced by the fluid ease of his own body. He kicked the discarded plates aside, his movements becoming sharp and purposeful once more. He reached for his leather pouch and his staff, the familiar wood grounding his grip. He tested the sling, letting the leather cord slide through his fingers, feeling the weight of the pocket where the stone would rest. He stood tall, the artificial weight of the king's gear now just a pile of cold metal on the floor. He turned toward the tent opening, his gaze fixed on the valley beyond. He stepped out into the light, leaving the heavy, suffocating burden behind him. David walked away from the camp, his boots crunching on the dry earth until the sound faded into the low, rhythmic murmur of the running stream. The brook cut through the valley floor, a vein of life in the parched landscape. He knelt at the water's edge, the cool air rising from the surface against his face. He plunged his hand into the current, the water swirling around his fingers, numbing the skin. He searched the bed, his touch reading the shape of every pebble. He pulled one out, turning it over in his palm. It was smooth, worn down by years of relentless water, perfectly balanced for the sling. He set it aside on the bank. He reached in again, his movements slow and deliberate, ignoring the distant, mocking shouts that drifted down from the ridge. He found a second, then a third, each stone feeling solid and dense in his grip. He tested their weight, flicking his wrist to feel the resistance of the air. He chose 5 in total, placing them one by one into the leather pouch at his side. The stones settled against his hip, a small, heavy weight that promised precision. He stood up, the water dripping from his hands, and wiped them on the dry grass. He checked the sling one final time, the leather supple and strong. He was ready. David turned his back on the brook and stepped onto the open floor of the valley. The ground here was hard, baked by the sun, and every footfall sounded sharp in the sudden quiet. He walked with a steady, measured pace, his eyes fixed on the horizon. As he cleared the final rise, the full scale of the valley opened before him. It was a vast, empty bowl of dust and heat. He felt the wind shift, pulling at his hair, but he did not falter. He was a small, singular figure against the expanse of the dry earth. Ahead, the shadow of the opposing ridge loomed, and he knew what waited in the darkness of that slope. He did not look for the army behind him. He did not look for the king in his tent. He kept his gaze locked forward, his hands loose at his sides, his fingers brushing the leather pouch where the stones rested. The distance between him and the center of the valley closed with every stride. He simply moved forward, his shadow stretching long. The distance vanished. A shadow detached itself from the opposing ridge, growing rapidly until it blocked the sun. The ground beneath David's feet began to vibrate with a heavy, rhythmic thud. He stopped. The giant stood before him, a wall of mass that seemed to pull the very air from the valley. A spear, long and thick as a tree trunk, cut through the light, its tip gleaming with a sharp, lethal edge. Then, the sound broke the stillness. It started as a low rumble, then erupted into a roar of laughter that echoed off the canyon walls. The giant's voice was a physical force, deep and grating, filling the space between them with derision. He spat words of curse and mockery. David stood his ground, his feet planted firmly in the dust. He did not flinch as the giant's shadow washed over him. The giant loomed, his chest heaving with breath, his eyes locked onto the small, still figure standing in the center of the dust. The confrontation had begun. The giant's laughter did not fade. It grew, a jagged sound that seemed to tear at the very air. He leaned forward, his presence a crushing weight, his voice a relentless barrage of insults that echoed against the canyon walls. Every word was a hammer, meant to break the spirit of the one standing below. David did not look away. He did not retreat. He waited for the exact moment the giant paused to draw breath. Then he spoke. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a strange, piercing clarity. "You come to me with a sword and a spear," David shouted, his tone steady and devoid of fear. "But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts." The declaration hung in the air, absolute and unyielding. The giant's laughter died instantly. A sudden, heavy silence descended upon the valley, so profound that the dry rustle of the wind against the rocks became the only sound. The armies on the hillsides held their breath, caught in the wake of the boy's words. The challenge had been issued. The silence shattered. A roar, raw and guttural, erupted from the giant as he lunged forward. The ground shuddered under the impact of his stride, a rhythmic pounding that traveled through the soles of David's feet. There was no hesitation in the giant's movement, only the singular, murderous intent to crush the opposition. He closed the gap with terrifying speed, his presence a dark, surging wave across the valley floor. David did not retreat. He did not circle. He leaned into the momentum of the moment and surged forward, running directly toward the incoming threat. The distance between them shrank with every heartbeat. The air grew heavy with the friction of the charge, whistling past as the two figures converged. David's focus was absolute. As he sprinted, his hand dropped to his side with the fluid, practiced grace of a shepherd. He reached in, his movements sharp and efficient, bypassing the hesitation. The giant was coming, and David was ready to meet him. The stone left the pouch, a smooth, cold weight that settled into the center of the leather cradle. David felt the familiar texture, the balance of the weight against his palm. He did not need to look down. He knew the feel of this tool, as well as he knew the rhythm of his own heartbeat. He looped the leather strap around his finger, the tension snapping taut as he pulled his arm back. He began the rotation. First a slow, controlled circle, then faster, the leather humming against the air. It was a sound he had heard 1,000 times in the hills of Bethlehem. A low, rhythmic whistle that signaled focus and intent. He leaned his weight into the movement, his body turning with the momentum of the sling. The circle widened, the speed increased. With every revolution, the tension in his shoulder grew, a coiled spring of potential energy waiting for the release. He was no longer a boy in a valley. He was a shepherd in the quiet dark of the night, practicing under the stars, preparing for a moment he had not known was coming. The sling blurred into a ring of motion around his head. The air whipped and snapped. He felt the pull of the stone, the centrifugal force straining against his grip, a perfect, singular focus. The moment arrived. The tension in the leather strap reached its absolute limit, a threshold of force that could no longer be contained. David's fingers opened. The release was instantaneous, a snap of energy that propelled the stone forward with a sharp, piercing whistle. It cut through the air, a gray blur against the backdrop of the valley. Time seemed to stretch, the world slowing to a crawl as the projectile traced its path. There was no hesitation in its trajectory, no wavering in its flight. It was the culmination of every hour spent in the hills, every throw made in the solitude of the wilderness. The distance closed in a heartbeat. The stone struck. A dull, heavy thud echoed across the open ground, a sound of absolute, final impact. It hit the mark with devastating precision, a singular point of contact that shattered the momentum of the charge. The air itself seemed to recoil from the force of the collision. For a fraction of a second, the motion of the entire valley hung suspended. The stone had found its destination. The impact was absolute, a clean, undeniable strike that silenced the roar of the giant and ended the standoff in a single, brutal instant. The impact halted the giant's forward momentum instantly. His head snapped back, the force of the stone overriding every instinct to stay upright. For a heartbeat, he stood frozen, a tower of defiance caught in a sudden, impossible stillness. Then, the balance shifted. His knees buckled, not in a controlled descent, but with the dead weight of a tree severed at its base. He swayed, his massive frame tilting into the empty air of the valley. The ground seemed to rush up to meet him. He reached out, fingers clawing at the dry earth, but there was no strength left to anchor his descent. He went down. The collapse was absolute. He hit the dirt face first, a final, jarring thud that vibrated through the souls of the soldiers watching from the ridges. Dust billowed out from the point of impact, a thick, gray cloud that rose to swallow the space where he had stood. The earth itself shuddered. Silence followed, heavy and absolute, as the figure remained motionless in the dirt. The giant was level. The silence held, a fragile, hollow thing that stretched across the valley floor. For several heartbeats, no one moved, no one spoke. The soldiers on the ridges stood frozen, their eyes fixed on the still form in the dust. Then, the air shifted. It began as a collective, sharp intake of breath, a sound like wind rushing through dry grass as thousands of men realized what they had just witnessed. The impossibility of the moment pressed down on them. The giant, who had been the singular source of their terror for 40 days, was gone. The spell that had gripped their hearts, the paralyzing weight of fear, began to fracture. A ripple of movement passed through the Israelite ranks. It started with a single soldier dropping his heavy shield, the metal clattering against the rock, and then it spread like a wildfire. The shock transformed into something else, a raw, surging energy that had been suppressed for too long. A roar erupted from the front lines. It was not a disciplined shout, but a primal, thunderous release of pent-up desperation and sudden, overwhelming hope. Across the valley, the Philistine lines did not hold. The sight of their champion, motionless and defeated, acted as a physical blow to their formation. The front ranks faltered, then recoiled, their confidence dissolving into raw, unadulterated panic. A shout went up from their camp, not of challenge, but of desperate warning. The cohesion that had defined their presence for 40 days shattered in an instant. Men turned, dropping their heavy gear into the dirt, their boots kicking up clouds of dust. As they scrambled toward the hills, the retreat was chaotic, a frantic surge of bodies pushing against one another in a blind bid for safety. They did not look back. They did not regroup. They simply ran, driven by the sudden crushing realization that their power had been broken. The Israelite soldiers, fueled by the roar of their own victory, surged forward from the ridges, their momentum now unstoppable. The valley floor became a scene of total upheaval. Where there had been a standoff, there was now a rout. The Philistine army was reduced to a fleeing mass, disappearing into the shadows of the distant slopes. Hope, long buried under the weight of fear, returned to the valley. The tide had turned. The dust began to settle, but the silence that followed was different from the one that had haunted the valley for 40 days. It was no longer heavy with the suffocating pressure of dread. Instead, it carried the weight of a profound, sudden clarity. The soldiers of Israel stood on the ridges, their weapons lowered, watching the horizon where their enemies had vanished. They looked at one another, and in their eyes, the fear that had defined their existence for weeks had been replaced by a quiet, trembling wonder. This was not just a military success. The tactical victory was merely the surface of something much deeper. The true collapse had occurred within the hearts of those who had forgotten their purpose. They had spent 40 days measuring their strength against a mountain of flesh, only to realize that the battle had never been theirs to win. The giant had been a mirror, reflecting their own lack of trust, but the fall of that giant had shattered the mirror entirely. A new conviction began to take root in the valley. It was the restoration of a faith that had been buried under pride and hesitation. David stood alone in the center of the valley, the air around him still thick with the scent of turned earth and spent energy. He did not look at the fallen giant. He looked toward the distant, rugged hills of Bethlehem. The silence here was a mirror of the nights he had spent under the canopy of stars, playing his harp in the dark. He traced the memory of those years, the long, solitary hours of guarding the flock, the weight of the staff in his grip, the sudden, violent movements of predators emerging from the thickets. He had not been merely tending sheep. He had been learning the rhythm of dependence. Every time he had stood his ground against a lion or a bear, he had been forging the resolve that brought him to this day. There were no crowds in those hills, no kings to witness his struggle, and no armies to cheer his success. There was only the duty of the shepherd and the presence of the Creator. David turned his back on the valley floor, his steps steady and deliberate. He left behind the remnants of the conflict, but he carried the weight of the lesson forward. The world would remember the sound of the stone and the fall of the massive form, but the true story was not found in the mechanics of the battle. It was written in the quiet surrender of a life that had ceased to rely on its own strength. Every soldier watching from the ridges, every king in his tent, and every observer in the years to come would have to face their own giants. These obstacles often appeared as insurmountable mountains, casting long shadows that threatened to consume all hope. Yet, the events of this day proved that size was an illusion. When a life is fully anchored in the Creator, the most imposing threats lose their power to intimidate. The giant had fallen, not because of a boy, but because of the absolute alignment of a heart with its source of power. This was the final, enduring truth of the valley. It was a promise that echoed long after the dust had settled and the armies had returned to their homes. No matter the scale of the opposition, no matter the depth of the fear, a life surrendered to the divine hand is a life that cannot be moved. When the spirit is yielded, the giant simply cannot remain standing.